In the summer of 2020, something extraordinary happened along the Florida coastline, something that most people never heard about, buried beneath election headlines and pandemic news cycles and the relentless noise of a world in crisis. The state of Florida began dumping hundreds of thousands of tons of oyster shells into the ocean, not in secret, not by accident, deliberately, methodically, with the calculated precision of scientists and ecologists who had spent years understanding why one of America's most productive coastal ecosystems had collapsed, and who believed they were doing something that had never quite been attempted at this scale before in American coastal history. And what happened next genuinely shocked even the people who designed the project. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to a time when Florida's coastline was alive in a way it simply no longer is. 100 years ago, the shallow bays and estuaries of Florida were dominated by massive, sprawling oyster reefs. These weren't small clusters of shells scattered on the seafloor. They were enormous living structures, some stretching for miles, rising from the bottom in dense, layered formations, like underwater cities teeming with life at every level and in every crevice. Every crab, every juvenile fish, every shrimp that would one day become someone's dinner likely started its life somewhere near an oyster reef. The reef was the nursery, the filter, the shelter, and the foundation of the entire coastal food web. It was not decoration, it was not incidental. It was the engine of a biological system that had sustained coastal Florida for thousands of years. And then, over the course of a single century, almost all of it disappeared. The decline was so gradual that most people never noticed it happening. Oyster harvesting had been a way of life in Florida for generations, and for a long time it seemed like the bay could absorb the pressure. Apalachicola Bay, nestled in the panhandle of Florida, where the land curves gracefully south toward the open Gulf of Mexico, was the crown jewel of the state's entire oyster industry. At its peak, this single bay produced more than 90% of Florida's oyster harvest. Oystermen, who had worked those waters for decades, would tell you the bay was practically vibrating with life beneath your boat. On calm days, you could hear the reefs crackling and popping just under the surface. That distinctive sound is the noise of thousands of tiny creatures living inside the reef structure, snapping shrimp, small fish darting between crevices, barnacles extending their feathery arms into the passing current. It was a world completely invisible from above and utterly extraordinary below. But upstream, far from the bay itself, things were changing in ways that no one in Apalachicola had any power to control. The cities of Georgia were growing rapidly, demanding more water from the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, Flint River Basin. Dams were constructed and expanded. Agricultural. Irrigation drew more water from the system. Less fresh water was reaching the bay. The salinity balance shifted in ways that favored the oyster's enemies. The oyster drill snail, a predator that historically died off during the regular pulses of fresh water that flushed through the bay from the Apalachicola River, began surviving year-round because those freshwater pulses were no longer arriving with the same frequency or volume. Disease organisms moved in. Then came the warming ocean temperatures associated with a changing climate, making every existing pressure worse and opening the door to new ones. And then came the hurricanes, one after another in successive seasons, each one churning up the seafloor, disrupting spawning cycles, burying shell beds under sediment, scattering the fragile reef foundations that oysters need to attach to and grow on. By the time anyone had a complete picture of what was happening, the bay had collapsed. In 2020, Florida officially closed the Apalachicola Bay oyster fishery. The announcement landed in the fishing communities there like a death in the family because, in many ways, it was. The closure was a 5-year moratorium, a firm and total halt to commercial wild oyster harvesting, intended to give the bay a chance to breathe and potentially rebuild. But the scientists who were brought in to understand the full scope of the collapse quickly realized that simply shutting down the fishery was not going to be enough on its own. The problem wasn't limited to overharvesting. The underlying physical structure of the bay had been damaged at a fundamental level that no moratorium could fix by itself. The reef substrate, the hard, complex, calcium-rich architectural framework that generations of oysters had built up over centuries, layer upon layer, and that future generations needed as the foundation to attach to and grow from, was gone. Decades of dredging for shell, the relentless force of storms and the slow grinding passage of time had reduced much of the ancient reef structure to a flat, largely featureless muddy bottom. And on a flat, muddy bottom, oyster larvae simply have nowhere to settle. There is no hard surface for them to grab onto. There's no chemical cue for them to follow. There's no way for the next generation of reef to begin. You do not just need oysters to make an oyster reef. You need something for the oysters to grow on first. And that something, it turned out, was the very shells that commercial harvesting had been removing from the system for over a century. This is where the true scale of the problem becomes almost incomprehensible when you try to fully hold it in your mind. A healthy oyster reef is built over decades, sometimes centuries, by successive generations of oysters dying and leaving their shells behind, and new larvae attaching to those shells and growing into adults who then die and add their shells to the growing structure. It is one of the most elegant and patient biological recycling systems in nature, a slow, continuous accumulation that operates on geological time and builds structures of extraordinary ecological complexity. But when you remove that foundation, when the shells are harvested, sent to restaurants, and never return to the water, the cycle breaks permanently. Each oyster that gets shucked and eaten represents a tiny piece of reef architecture that has left the ecosystem forever. Multiply that loss by 100 years of commercial harvesting across the entire Gulf Coast, and the math becomes staggering. According to research synthesized from hundreds of restoration sites spanning thousands of kilometers of American coastline, historic oyster reef abundance has declined by more than 85% globally. 85% of something that took thousands of years to build, gone in a single human lifetime. The researchers, ecologists, and state officials who came together to form the Apalachicola Bay System Initiative understood all of this deeply and precisely. They knew that introducing oyster larvae, or young oysters, back into the bay without first rebuilding the substrate would be like trying to grow a forest on bare concrete. So they developed a restoration plan that was, in terms of its scope and ambition, unlike almost anything attempted before in Florida's coastal management history. They were going to put the shells back, not just a handful of shells as a gesture, not a small pilot project. They were going to move massive quantities of substrate material back into the water, hundreds of thousands of tons of recycled shell and limestone and alternative reef structure, and try to recreate as closely as possible the physical conditions that had once made Apalachicola Bay one of the most productive estuarine systems in the entire northern hemisphere. The full project involved state agencies, federal funding through multiple programs, university research teams, nonprofit, conservation organizations, fishing community stakeholders, and a collective determination that is genuinely rare in environmental restoration work. It ultimately cost more than $38 million, and what they found when they came back to assess the reefs changed the way marine scientists think about the timeline and capacity of ecosystem recovery. Before getting to those results, it is worth taking a moment to understand the mechanics of what was actually done out on the water, because those mechanics reveal something fundamental about how nature operates when it is given even the smallest opportunity. The core challenge in oyster reef restoration is providing the right kind of hard surface in exactly the right place. Baby oysters, called spat, are free-swimming creatures for only a very brief window of time after they hatch and are released into the water column. They are carried by tides and currents, and when their biology tells them they are ready to settle, they need to find a hard surface to permanently attach to. They are not random or indiscriminate about this. They are drawn by specific chemical signals. The smell of calcium carbonate, the scent of existing oyster shell and living oysters. They actively navigate toward other oysters. There's something almost intentional about it, as if they instinctively know that where oysters have lived before, the conditions are right for oysters to live again. This biological behavior, this chemical navigation toward the scent of home, is the fundamental engine that makes reef restoration possible. But it only works if you first give the drifting larvae something to find. The early attempts at restoration in Apalachicola Bay were instructive in the way that scientific setbacks always are. In the eastern sections of the bay, where the currents run fast and persistent and strong, researchers found that loose shells scattered across the seafloor would begin migrating within weeks. The shells drifted with the moving water, piled up in places that weren't ideal, and failed to establish the stable, elevated platform that larvae needed for successful settlement. This was a serious problem because deploying material that immediately disperses is wasted effort and wasted funding. The research team had to adapt, moving toward heavier structural materials in high energy zones, large pieces of limestone rock and purpose-built concrete structures that could resist current, movement, and provide the physical stability that loose shell could not maintain. When they made that adjustment, the response from the ecosystem was immediate and striking. Within 14 months of placing their experimental large limestone structures in appropriate locations, and the monitoring teams were finding market-sized oysters growing on the rock surfaces. They were finding fish taking shelter in the structure. They were finding crabs occupying the crevices and small invertebrates colonizing every available surface. The reef was alive on a timeline that had exceeded even their more optimistic projections. In the calmer, more protected waters of the bay, where current velocities were lower and the bottom was more stable, recycled oyster shell worked with impressive effectiveness. Shells collected from restaurants across the Florida Panhandle region, dried and cured for several months to eliminate disease organisms and bacteria, were bagged and deployed onto the seafloor in strategically chosen locations, based on water quality data, current patterns, and proximity to existing oyster populations. And then the teams waited and watched. What they were monitoring for was spatfall, the event when oyster larvae drifting through the water column in enormous numbers detect the chemical signals rising from the shell below and begin the process of permanent settlement. When it came quickly. Monitoring surveys of restored reef areas began returning recruitment data that the scientists had not expected to see on such a compressed timeline. The larvae were finding the shells, they were attaching, they were growing into visible, measurable, thriving reef. The broader scientific literature on oyster restoration, drawn from hundreds of projects across the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic coast, presents a picture that is remarkable in its consistency. A comprehensive meta-analysis that examined data from hundreds of paired comparison sites spanning more than 3,000 kilometers of American coastline found that restoration was associated with a 21-fold increase in oyster production compared to degraded, unrestored habitats. Not 21%, 21 times the production. That is not incremental improvement. That is a transformation, a wholesale reversal of ecological decline, achieved through the deliberate act of putting substrate material back into water that had been stripped of it. The same research found that habitat provisioning, the capacity of the reef to shelter, feed, and support other marine life, increased by between 34 and 97% on restored sites compared to degraded ones. Nitrogen removal from the water column, one of the critical ecosystem services that filter feeding oysters provide, increased by 54%. And restored reefs, given enough time into protection, ultimately performed at levels statistically comparable to natural reference reefs, meaning that what looked like permanent ecological ruin had, in fact, retained the latent capacity to recover to something approaching its original function. On Florida's east coast in the Indian River Lagoon, researchers from the University of Central Florida were tracking something equally remarkable: the speed at which the community of living things associated with oyster reefs shifted from a degraded state toward a healthy one after restoration. Their findings showed that species diversity and community composition on restored reefs shifted toward the patterns seen on healthy, living reference reefs within just 12 months of restoration. Recovery of species abundance, the actual number of individual organisms inhabiting the reef, came within 18 months. In ecological terms, that is almost instantaneous recovery. And it was happening not because of any extraordinary intervention, but simply because shells had been placed in the water, and the biological processes that had been waiting for exactly that opportunity were finally able to operate. What unfolds in that 18-month window is a cascade of interconnected biological events that illustrates with extraordinary clarity why oyster reefs matter so much to the broader ecosystem beyond the oysters themselves. When shell material settles onto the seafloor, the first colonizers arrive within days. Tiny invertebrates, worms, amphipods, microscopic crustaceans that will exploit any new hard surface. These small organisms attract slightly larger predators. Fish begin to appear, at first just passing, through, then spending more time, then claiming territory. Crabs move into the crevices and establish themselves. Shrimp forage along the reef margins where the structure meets the open sediment. Mud-dwelling species colonize the sediment that accumulates around the base of the growing reef. Each new arrival adds complexity, adds food sources, adds shelter, and that added complexity draws the next species in, and the one after that. It is a cascade of ecological recovery triggered by the initial act of placing substrate, and it operates entirely on its own once it begins. Back in Apalachicola Bay, the systematic monitoring conducted during the moratorium years was revealing something that the research teams had hoped for, but hadn't been certain they would see. The water itself was changing. Oysters are filter feeders by nature. They draw water through their gills, extract phytoplankton, suspended sediment, bacteria, and organic particles from it, and release cleaner, clearer water back into the bay. A single adult oyster filters up to 50 gallons of water every day. When you consider the millions of oysters colonizing the expanding restoration sites across the bay, the aggregate filtration capacity was growing measurably. Turbidity levels in areas near restored reef sites were declining. Water that had been murky and light-limiting was becoming progressively clearer. And as clarity improved, something that had vanished from those waters years before began quietly reappearing. Seagrass was returning. Seagrass meadows are among the most ecologically valuable and most underappreciated habitats in the coastal marine world. They serve as nursery habitat for dozens of commercially important fish species. They store carbon in their roots and sediment at rates that rival some terrestrial forests. They stabilize the seafloor against erosion and wave action. They support feeding by manatees and sea turtles. They harbor hundreds of species of small fish, invertebrates, and algae that form the base of the coastal food web. But seagrass is entirely dependent on sunlight for photosynthesis, and in turbid water, light cannot penetrate to the bottom. As oyster filtration improved water clarity across restored areas, light reached the seafloor where it hadn't in years. Dormant seeds and rhizomes in the sediment began to germinate and spread. Charter fishing captains working the bay started saying something their clients hadn't heard from them in a very long time. The seagrass is growing back out there. The reestablishment of that relationship, oysters clearing the water, seagrass responding to the improved light, the seagrass meadows then providing shelter and feeding habitat that makes the reef community richer and more diverse, is exactly the kind of cascading positive feedback that ecosystem restoration scientists theorize about, but rarely get to observe playing out so visibly and so rapidly in a real, large-scale system. It confirmed what the models had suggested, that Apalachicola Bay hadn't just lost its oysters. It had lost the entire interconnected web of relationships that the oyster reef anchored, and restoring the physical foundation of that web was enough to trigger the whole system's return. Across Florida more broadly, the shell recycling programs that formed an essential part of the restoration supply chain were growing and spreading. The logic is simple and satisfying. Restaurants that serve oysters collect the empty shells instead of disposing of them in landfills. The shells are picked up on a regular schedule, transported to curing sites where they air dry for months to eliminate pathogens, and then redeployed in restoration projects. At the scale of individual restaurants, the contribution is small. At the scale of hundreds of participating establishments across an entire coast, it becomes ecologically meaningful. Programs like Shuck and Share, operating across more than a dozen Florida counties, had collected nearly 1 million pounds of recycled shell by 2023. The Florida Oceanographic Oyster Restoration Program had used restaurant shells and volunteer labor to restore nearly 60,000 square feet of reef in the Sankt, Lucy Estuary, and the Indian River Lagoon. In the Matanzas River near the University of Florida's Whitney Laboratory, Eagle Scout troops were hand-building thousands of biodegradable reef modules, constructed without any plastic components, and placing them in the water as conservation service projects. After just 4 months of submersion, each module was recruiting between 150 and 200 oysters. 3,000 modules multiplied by 150 oysters each begins to suggest the scale of what dedicated community participation can achieve. The economic argument that runs beneath all of this work is one of the most compelling and least understood aspects of oyster reef restoration. Research has concluded that a functioning oyster reef produces more than $500 of measurable ecosystem services per year for every few thousand pounds of material that makes up its structure. Services including water filtration, habitat provision, fishery support, and shoreline protection. The Nature Conservancy has made the striking calculation that restoring 1,300 acres of oyster reef would provide water filtration services equivalent to the construction and operation of a full-scale wastewater treatment plant. That is not metaphor or approximation. It is a direct economic comparison between a biological process and a mechanical one, and in that comparison, the biology wins comprehensively on cost. And on top of the water quality equation, studies in the Gulf of Mexico have demonstrated that oyster reefs reduce incoming wave energy by between 76 and 99%. In a state that faces major hurricanes routinely, in a coastal zone where land is being consumed by erosion and sea level rise at the rate of a football field every 100 minutes, a reef that absorbs 90% of wave energy before it can reach a salt marsh or a mangrove shoreline is coastal infrastructure in the most direct and important sense of that word. In early 2026, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission announced the news that the Apalachicola fishing community had been waiting 5 years to hear. The bay was being reopened to wild oyster harvest. The reopening was careful and limited, restricted to specific zones where restoration monitoring showed self-sustaining oyster populations, and where the ecological indicators pointed toward genuine recovery. Management rules were written with the explicit goal of preventing a repeat of the collapse. Harvest limits, seasonal restrictions, required monitoring, and provisions for closing zones again if indicators deteriorated. The people who had spent 5 years restoring the bay were not naive about what the reopening meant. The upstream water management issues had not been resolved. The climate pressures had not reversed. Everyone in the room understood that what had been rebuilt was still fragile and that maintaining it would require vigilance, restraint, and continued investment indefinitely into the future. But the reefs were there, the oysters were there, and the bay that had been written off as ecologically dead had demonstrated, to the surprise of nearly everyone who watched it happen, that it was capable of coming back. What Florida has shown through this experiment, through the $38 million spent, the millions of shells deployed, the years of monitoring, the community of scientists and fishermen and volunteers and state officials who all pulled in the same direction, is something that matters well beyond the boundaries of Apalachicola Bay. It is a demonstration that the popular assumption about environmental degradation, the assumption that says damage past a certain point becomes irreversible and permanent, is not always true. That natural systems retain a latent capacity for recovery that persists even after severe and prolonged degradation. that the biological and chemical processes that build healthy ecosystems are not destroyed by damage. They are only suppressed, waiting for conditions to improve enough to resume, and that sometimes improving those conditions requires nothing more complicated than returning to the water the material that was removed from it. 500,000 tons of shells in the ocean. What happened next surprised everyone. Life came back, faster than the models predicted, in greater abundance than the most optimistic projections, through mechanisms that scientists are still working to fully understand. And as the data from this restoration effort continues to accumulate, and as the lessons learned in Apalachicola Bay and Charlotte Harbor and San Carlos Bay and the Indian River Lagoon are shared with coastal restoration communities around the world, the story of what Florida did will matter to every estuary that has lost its oyster reefs. Because that story is ultimately not about shells or data or funding or policy. It is about what becomes possible when enough people decide that something worth saving is worth the effort of saving it, and then actually do the work. The oystermen who lived through the closure years carry a particular kind of knowledge that no university can confer. They know the bay in ways that instruments and monitoring stations cannot fully capture. They know how the water moves differently on an incoming tide versus an outgoing one, how the oysters behave differently in the weeks before and after a cold front, where the deep channels run and where the shallow flats warm up fastest in spring. This is knowledge. But the science and the traditional knowledge began to converge. Researchers from the Apalachicola Bay System Initiative made a point of including fishing community members in the restoration planning and monitoring processes because they understood that the fishermen were seeing things from their boats that the scientists were missing from their sampling stations. When a veteran oysterman said the water looked different in a particular area, that observation was taken seriously. When fishing guides reported seeing species returning to places they hadn't frequented in years, those reports were incorporated into the ecological picture being assembled. The restoration of the bay was not purely a scientific project imposed from outside. It was a collaboration that, imperfectly and at times contentiously, tried to weave together the formal knowledge of ecology and the informal knowledge of people who had spent their lives reading the same water. That collaborative dimension matters enormously, because no restoration project survives without the support of the communities it affects. Restoration that is done to a community rather than with a community tends to fail over the long term, because the people whose livelihoods and identities are tied to the ecosystem have to become its stewards if the investment is going to hold. In Apalachicola, that stewardship is now embedded in the management framework that governs the reopened fishery. The fishing community has a seat at the table in monitoring decisions and harvest management reviews. The goal is a system where the people who harvest the oysters have both the motivation and the formal role to protect the resource they depend on, where the incentives of the marketplace and the imperatives of ecological sustainability are aligned rather than opposed. This model, still imperfect and still being refined, is being watched closely by coastal restoration practitioners and fisheries managers in other parts of the world, facing similar crises. The Gulf of Mexico is not the only place where oyster reefs have collapsed. Similar stories are playing out in Chesapeake Bay, along the coasts of Europe, in Australia, and parts of Asia. In each of those places, the same basic dynamics have operated: overharvesting, habitat degradation, loss of substrate, collapse of populations that once seemed inexhaustible. And in each of those places, people are asking the same basic question that Florida started asking in earnest around 2020. Is it too late, or is there still something here worth trying to save? Florida's answer at this point is clear. It is not too late. The bay is alive. The shells are working. And the work continues. There is one more dimension of this story that deserves to be named, because it is easy to lose in the data and the policy discussions and the scientific findings. The oyster reef is not just an ecosystem service delivery system. It is not just a wastewater treatment plant in biological form, or a breakwater made of living organisms, or a carbon sink, or a fish nursery. It is, in some older and harder to articulate sense, a place. Apalachicola Bay is a place that shaped people, that gave communities their identity and their livelihood and their sense of who they were in relationship to the natural world. The collapse of the reef was not only an ecological loss, it was a cultural loss, a loss of meaning and continuity that no dollar figure can capture and no monitoring metric can measure. The restoration of that reef is, on one level, a restoration of habitat. On another level, it is an attempt to restore something about what it means to live in that place, to be from that place, to be bound to it across generations. Whether that is fully achievable is a question that no scientific paper can answer, but it is a question worth asking, and the fact that it is being asked at all, that the restoration of an oyster reef is understood by the people working on it as something that matters beyond the biological and the economic, suggests something important about what we are capable of when we decide that what we have lost is worth trying to recover.